The smell hit first. Durance Hub had 1,000 smells fighting each other at any given moment. Wet fur, burnt metal, something sweet and rotting from the food stalls on the lower deck, chemicals that did not have names in any human language. Rail Dunn had passed through this station enough times that he stopped noticing the smell years ago, the same way he stopped noticing the noise and the crowds and the strange look some of the aliens gave him when he walked by. He was not here for the market. He had a parts manifest to pick up from a freight office on the far side of the hub. It was a 20-minute walk, and cutting through the market saved him 10. That was the only reason he went in. The market at Durance Hub ran the full length of a long inner corridor, 2 levels high, with stalls pressed so close together that the edges of the display cases overlapped. There were fabrics and tools and weapons and food and things Rail could not name and did not try to. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes ahead, the way a person walks when they are trying to make clear that they are not shopping. He almost made it through without stopping. The stall was near the far end, tucked between a spice merchant and a seller of second-hand navigation parts. It was a small stall, not much to look at, with a cluster of enclosures stacked on a folding table. Most of them held creatures Rail did not recognize. The alien running the stall was called Hoss, broad, four-armed, with the particular kind of face that looked permanently bored. Hoss was eating something out of a container and barely glancing at the customers who passed. Rail was not going to stop. He would have kept walking. Then something moved in the bottom enclosure. It was so small that Rail almost missed it. A creature the size of his hand pressed against the front wall of the enclosure, looking directly at him, not at the alien who had paused to browse nearby, not at the group of loud, wealthy-looking beings who were making interested noises at the enclosure above it, directly at Rail, with a focus that felt almost deliberate. Rail stopped walking. The creature was, he had no other word for it, a dragon. That was not the official name. Hoss, when Rail finally walked over and asked, said the species was called Draconid minor, but to Rail's eyes it was a dragon. It had 4 short legs, a long tail with a flat ridge running down it, a wedge-shaped head, and 2 wings folded tight against its back. The wings were slightly uneven. One sat a little higher than the other. Its scales were dark, somewhere between gray and green, depending on how the light hit them. It was still staring at him. Rail leaned down a little. The creature moved with him, tracking his face. Its fire sacs, 2 nodes on either side of its throat, gave off a faint orange glow, like embers that were not quite ready to catch. "What is this one?" Rail asked. Hoss glanced over, saw which enclosure Rail was looking at, and made a sound that translated roughly as mild dismissal. Draconid minor, defective, wings are crooked, fire output is basically nothing. I've had it for 2 months. Nobody wants it. I've had people pick it up and put it right back down. Why? Because what's the point? A draconid is supposed to be impressive. Status symbol. You want something people notice. That thing, Hoss waved one of his 4 arms vaguely at the enclosure, nobody notices. Rail looked at the creature again. The creature looked back. It had not looked away once. Every other creature in the stall was doing something, sleeping, moving around, making noise. This one just stood at the front of its enclosure and watched Rail with an expression that Rail did not know how to read, but which made him feel, for reasons he could not explain, faintly guilty about the idea of walking away. He straightened up. He told himself he was going to keep walking. He asked how much. Hoss named a price so low that Rail actually looked at him to check if it was a joke. It was not. Hoss had the expression of someone who had already written something off as a loss and just wanted it gone. Rail paid. He told himself he did not know why he was doing this. He was lying to himself, but he did not push on it. Hoss opened the enclosure. The creature walked out onto Rail's hand before Rail had fully extended it, like it had been waiting, like the movement was something it had already decided would happen long before Rail showed up. It was light, barely anything. Its claws were gentle on his palm. It walked up his arm to his shoulder, tucked itself against the side of his neck, and was still. Hoss gave Rail a small bag of feeding pellets and a single card with basic care instructions. The card looked like it had been printed years ago and handed out many times. Good luck with it, Hoss said, already back to his food. Rail walked out of the market. He still had a parts manifest to pick up. He was now 12 minutes behind schedule because he had stopped for something he had not come for and did not plan to have. The creature on his shoulder was warm. Its breathing was slow and even. Rail walked. He did not say anything for a while. Then, because he was alone and there was no one to hear him be ridiculous, he said quietly, "I'm going to call you Cinder." The creature made a sound. It was very small, just a low vibration more than a real noise, felt more than heard. But it happened right after he said the name. Rail noticed. He filed it away without examining it too closely. He picked up his manifest. He walked back to his ship. He did not look at Cinder again until he was inside with the hatch sealed, but he knew the whole time exactly where she was, because the warmth of her did not move once. She stayed exactly where she had chosen to be from the first moment she saw him. He did not think about what that meant yet. That would come later. 3 days out from Durance Hub, Rail understood he had a problem. The problem was not Cinder. Cinder was, by any practical measure, the easiest living thing he had ever shared a space with. She ate a small amount from the bag Hoss had given him twice a day without fuss. She did not make noise except for the low, barely audible hum she produced when she was settled and calm. She did not knock things over or chew through cables or require any of the complicated maintenance that Rail had half expected when he walked out of that market with something alive on his shoulder. The problem was that he was already attached to her. This was a problem because Rail Dunn did not get attached to things. He had spent the better part of 15 years running cargo routes alone through the mid and outer lanes of Concord space, and he had managed this entire time to avoid acquiring anything that needed him back. No crew, no pets, no relationships that lasted longer than a port stay. This was a choice, not an accident. He had looked at his life and decided that the maintenance cost of caring about things was higher than he was willing to pay. And yet, he caught himself talking to her on the second day, not full sentences, just commenting out loud on what he was doing, adjusting the transit plot, running the engine check, making something to eat. She would sit on the edge of the console or on his shoulder and track him with those eyes, and he would narrate, and then he would catch himself doing it and stop, and then 15 minutes later he would be doing it again. She slept on his chest at night. This had started on the first night without any decision being made. He woke up and she was there, curled just below his collarbone, warm and still. He had stared at the ceiling for a while and then gone back to sleep. The way station at Bren Junction was a small stop fuel and a short docking window. Rail did not usually leave the ship at way station stops, but he needed a specific coolant coupling that the ship's stock had run low on, and the station's maintenance bay kept them. He walked through the station with Cinder on his shoulder. She attracted exactly the kind of attention that Hoss had said she would not. A few glances, nothing more. A palm-sized dragon with uneven wings and a faint orange glow was not an impressive sight by the standards of the galaxy. He was halfway to the maintenance bay when someone stopped him. She was old, even by the standards of the Vareni, who lived long lives, tall and thin, with skin that had gone almost entirely to the grey-silver that came with extreme age, and eyes that were pale and very focused. She wore a plain coat with several small instruments clipped to it. She had been walking in the opposite direction, and she stopped so suddenly when she saw Cinder that Rail took half a step back out of reflex. She said, in Concord Standard, "Where did you get that?" Rail said, "Market at Durance Hub." She stared at Cinder for another moment. Then she said, "I need you to come with me, please. I am not a threat. I am a researcher. My name is Dr. Serath Ulo. What I need to tell you is important." Rail had learned, over the years, to read the difference between someone who was about to cause trouble and someone who was genuinely alarmed. Dr. Ulo was the second kind. Her hands were not moving toward anything. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. He followed her to a small sitting area off the main corridor. She sat across from him and looked at Cinder for a long time before she spoke. "A Draconid minor bond," she said. is not a pet bond. I want you to understand that clearly before I say anything else." Rael waited. The Draconid miner is an empathic species. They are capable of linking their nervous system not metaphorically, but at a biological level to one other being, one in their entire life. When this happens, the link is permanent. It cannot be reversed. It does not fade. She paused. The creature you are carrying has bonded to you, from the look of it, fully. The bond began when you made eye contact. It completed when she chose to stay. Rael looked at Cinder. Cinder was watching Dr. Ulo with a calm, assessing look. "There are consequences," Dr. Ulo continued. "If you die, she will die within hours. Her system cannot survive the severance. If she dies, you will experience neurological grief at a level that has, in documented cases, been fatal to the bonded individual. You are linked. You are now each other's primary survival condition." Rael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a lot." "Yes. The vendor said she was defective." Dr. Ulo made a very specific expression. "The Draconid's fire sacs are not defective, they are dormant. A Draconid miner's fire output scales with the threat level it perceives toward its bonded individual. In a calm environment with no threats, there is almost no output. The faint glow you are seeing is her resting state." She let that sit for a second. "Have you been in any dangerous situations since you acquired her?" "No." "Good," Dr. Ulo said. "I would encourage you to keep it that way." Something in the way she said it made Rael ask, "Why? What happens if I'm not?" She met his eyes. "We do not know the full upper limit of output for a fully bonded Draconid miner. The bond records we have are old and incomplete. What we know is that the protection instinct in a bonded individual is not proportional to the size of the creature. It is proportional to the threat level. The Draconid does not calculate what it is capable of. It simply responds to how much danger you are in." Rael thought about Hoss calling her defective. He thought about the way Cinder had stood at the front of that enclosure and watched him, and only him, out of every being who had walked past that stall. He said, "She picked me out of a crowd." "Yes. Why me?" Dr. Ulo was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who did not know the answer, but the quiet of someone choosing how to say it. "That," she said finally, "is the question we have not been able to answer. Draconid miners have been sold and kept as companions by dozens of species for centuries. In all that time, a full bond has been recorded only a handful of times. Never, until now, with a human." Rael did not say anything. Dr. Ulo stood. She gave him a small card with her contact information. She said, "If anything changes, if she changes, I would very much like to know." Rael walked back to his ship. He got the coolant coupling on the way. He did the whole walk with Cinder on his shoulder, and she rode exactly the same way she always did, easy and still, like she had been there her entire life. Back on the ship, he sat down at the console. He looked at her for a while. She looked back. He said, "Apparently you're not defective." She made the low hum. The fire sacs glowed a little warmer for a second, then settled. Rael turned back to the console and pulled up the transit plot. He did not sleep on his back anymore. He slept on his side, with Cinder in the hollow between his chest and his arm, because that was where she settled, and that was, he had decided, just how it was going to be. He did not examine this too carefully. He had a cargo run to finish. The Bren corridor had a reputation. Every pilot who ran the outer cargo lanes knew it. The corridor was a stretch of transit space between two uninhabited systems, long enough that you were committed once you entered, isolated enough that no Concord patrol covered it consistently. Pirates had worked it for decades. The smart ones were not violent about it. They scrambled your transit signal, you stopped, they boarded, you paid a toll, and everyone went home. It was almost a system. Cargo haulers factored it into their route costs the way they factored in fuel. Rael had run the corridor 11 times. He had paid the toll twice. The other 9 times, nobody had bothered him. He was not thinking about pirates when the scramble hit. He was eating and reading an update on the delivery window for his current run, and Cinder was asleep in the chest pocket of his jacket where she had taken to spending her days when she was not on his shoulder or investigating the small warm patch behind the engine access panel that she had discovered on day 4 and apparently considered hers. The ship lurched out of transit. Rail put down his food and pulled up sensors. 2 ships, close and fast. A scramble signal still cycling. His engines were running, but they had nowhere to go. The scramble had collapsed his transit corridor, and trying to rebuild it with 2 ships sitting on top of him would take longer than they would give him. He was not alarmed. This was the corridor. He knew how this went. The communication request came in. He accepted. The face on screen was wide and heavy, armored already, the particular deep-scaled look of a Galthrek. Rail knew the species, big, well-armored, generally professional about piracy, which was almost a comfort. Cargo manifest and ship registration, the Galthrek said. 2 of my crew will board to verify. You cooperate, we take a standard toll. You're back in transit in under an hour. Sure, Rail said. He was not worried about the cargo. It was machine parts, industrial equipment, nothing anybody wanted enough to steal rather than toll. He was not worried about himself. He had been through this before. He put his hand over the pocket where Cinder was sleeping and kept it there. This was new. He had not had anything to be careful about before. The boarding party came through the docking collar. 2 Galthrek, both armored, both carrying weapons. They were not pointing at anything yet. Professional. The first one gestured at the cargo bay door and Rail opened it. The second one stood near Rail, not touching him, just close enough to make a point. The inspection ran normally for about 4 minutes. Then the second Galthrek got impatient. Rail did not know what changed in the calculation. Maybe the cargo was less valuable than expected. Maybe he had some quota to meet. But the Galthrek turned from bored and professional to sharp and physical in the span of about 2 seconds. He grabbed Rail by the front of the jacket and shoved him hard against the wall. The manifest pad clattered across the floor. Rail hit the wall, his head knocked against it. He got one hand between himself and the wall and kept his other hand flat over the pocket. Too late. The impact woke Cinder. He felt her move the moment she came awake, not the slow, stretching movement of a creature waking up gently, but the immediate, fully alert shift of something that had been asleep and was now not. He felt her go still in a different way than sleeping, still, tighter, coiled. The Galthrek raised his weapon, not to shoot, to threaten. He held it level with Rail's head and said something about the manifest that Rail did not fully hear, because at exactly that moment Cinder came out of the pocket. She was fast. Rail had not seen her move fast before. He had not had a reason to. She cleared the pocket, crossed the distance from Rail's chest to the Galthrek's weapon arm in a movement that was too quick and too direct to look like something a hand-sized creature should be capable of, and she landed on the armored forearm with all 4 claws locked in. The Galthrek made a noise. She was not orange anymore. She had been faintly orange for weeks, that low, resting glow. She was white, flat, clean white, coming from the fire sacs on either side of her throat, so bright it cast hard shadows. Her wings, the uneven ones that Hoss had called defective, were open and flat, and even in that moment Rail noticed they were not uneven now. They were out and full, and even, and the minor difference that had made her look wrong in that enclosure had simply vanished under whatever was happening in her body. The armored forearm, under her claws, began to go dark. Not burned, not yet, but the armor was reading heat and darkening in response, the way all Galthrek military armor did under thermal stress. The Galthrek yelled. He tried to shake her off. She did not come off. The second crew member came out of the cargo bay at the noise. He stopped in the corridor entrance. He looked at his partner. He looked at the white glowing creature locked onto his partner's arm. He looked at Rail. Rail was standing against the wall, hands still up, watching. He did not try to stop her. He had made a decision, rapidly, in the second after she cleared his pocket, that he was going to trust Dr. Ulo's account and stay out of the way. The second crew member raised his weapon. Cinder turned her head and looked at him, just looked. The fire sacs stayed white. Her eyes caught the light and threw it back. The second crew member lowered his weapon. He did it the way a person does something they cannot fully explain, not like someone choosing to lower a weapon, but like someone who had arrived at a wall and simply could not go further. Cinder released the first Galthrek's arm. She crossed back to Rail and climbed to his shoulder, and as she moved, the white light began dropping white to pale orange to the faint ember glow he was used to. By the time she settled against his neck, she was almost back to normal. Almost. There was still a warmth coming off her that was not quite resting warmth. The two Galthrek left the ship. They went back through the docking collar and sealed it behind them without a word. A minute later, the scramble signal dropped. The transit corridor came back up clean. Rail stood in the middle of his own ship for a moment, then walked to the console and put it back in transit. His hands were steady. He noticed with mild surprise, not shaking. What he was tired. He sat down. Cinder moved from his shoulder to his knee and settled there, tucking her tail around his hand. The armor on the Galthrek's forearm, Galthrek military grade, rated for direct energy weapon exposure, had been darkened in a precise arc where her claws had contacted it. Not melted, not destroyed, just marked thoroughly in a way that was going to be difficult to explain. Rail looked down at Cinder. She looked back up at him. The fire sacks were dim and settled. She looked, if anything, slightly smug, or maybe that was something he was projecting. He honestly could not tell. He said, "You are a lot, you know that." She blinked at him slowly. He reached down and very carefully put one finger against the side of her head, the way he had started doing without deciding to. She leaned into it. In the command ship sitting 2 kilometers off his stern, the captain of the piracy unit watched his 2 crew members return with no cargo, no toll, and one set of burned forearm armor between them. He listened to their account. Then he sat for a while looking at the sensor image of the cargo hauler re-entering transit. He disengaged and left. He never ran the Bren corridor again. He also never talked about what happened, which meant the story did not spread the way it might have. But 2 Galthrek crew members did not forget it. They never forgot it. And when they eventually did talk about it, years later, the detail they kept coming back to was not the fire. It was the way the creature had looked at the second crew member, not threatening, not roaring or posturing or warning. Just looking. And how that had been, somehow, so much worse. 6 months after Durance Hub, a file existed in the Concord Intelligence Archive that had not been there before. It was not a large file. It was a collection of incident reports, cross-referenced and flagged by an analyst who had noticed a pattern. 3 separate events, 3 separate locations, involving 1 human cargo hauler and 1 small registered creature of species designation Draconid minor. The analyst had attached a note to the file that read, "Unclear threat profile. Recommend contact." The file made its way up. Files with unclear threat profiles usually did. Rail did not know the file existed. He found out it existed when he arrived at Durance Hub for a routine cargo pickup, and the manifest office was empty and a Lethani diplomat was waiting for him instead. The Lethani introduced himself as Delegate Oren. He was small, soft-spoken, with the wide, calm eyes that the Lethani carried as a species feature rather than an expression. He said he had just a few questions. He said there was a meeting room nearby. He said several interested parties had been hopping to speak with Rail at his convenience. Rail looked at him. Cinder, on his shoulder, looked at him. Rail said, "Sure." The meeting room was not large, but it was full. Admiral Vurath of the Concord Fleet was their Senari, tall, grey-blue, with the particular stillness that high-ranked Senari carried like armor. 2 of her aides, 3 researchers, species he did not immediately recognize. Delegate Oren, who closed the door and took a chair at the far end, and 2 human Concord officers who were there, Rail understood, so that he would feel less alone in the room. He did not particularly need that, but he appreciated the thought. Admiral Vurath spoke first. She was polite. She was also clearly someone who did not have much practice at being polite to cargo haulers, and it showed around the edges. She said that the Concorde was aware of 3 incidents: the Bren corridor boarding, a dockworker at Selthar Station who had approached Rail with apparent intent to rob him and who had spent 2 weeks in the station medical bay afterward, and a Concord Customs inspection team at Paro Transit who had flagged Rail's ship on a false positive and whose ranking officer had, for reasons he filed under personal discretion, released Rail without completing the inspection. Rail listened. Cinder sat on his shoulder and was still. The Admiral said that the Concord had questions. She said that a creature with these capabilities was of significant interest. She said that the possibility of studying the bond, of potentially replicating the conditions that produced it, was something the Concord fleet would fund generously. She used the word asset. She did not say the word about Cinder. She said it about the situation. Rail waited until she was done. Then he said, "No." Vurath paused. She was not used to no, not delivered like that, flat and final, with no apology wrapped around it. She said, "We are not suggesting any harm to the creature. We are talking about observation, research, understanding." Rail said, "No. The Concord fleet would compensate you significantly for your cooperation." "No." One of the aides leaned forward to say something. Cinder turned her head. She turned it slowly, the way she did when something had her full attention. She looked at the aide. The fire sacks did not change. She made no sound. She simply shifted her head and looked at the aide with the same focused, unblinking attention she had given Rail that first day in the market, the attention that had stopped him walking. The aide did not finish his sentence. He sat back. He seemed to be reassessing whether he wanted to continue. Vurath looked at Cinder. Cinder moved her gaze from the aide to Vurath. The Admiral was, by any measure, a formidable being. She had commanded fleets. She had held her rank for 4 decades. She had a record that included boarding actions and direct combat decisions and everything in between. She held Cinder's gaze for 4 seconds. Then she looked away. She did not do it like someone choosing to look away. She did it like someone who had reached a wall and found, quietly, that they did not want to find out what was on the other side. The room was very quiet. Rail stood up. He thanked them for the meeting. He picked up his cargo manifest from the table. It had been placed there when he came in, one small act of normalcy in the middle of all of this, and he walked to the door. Delegate Orin watched him go. He was the smallest person in the room and had said almost nothing during the entire meeting. After the door closed, he sat for a moment while the Admiral composed herself and the aides and researchers began murmuring among themselves. Then Orin opened his personal record and wrote, "The dragon did not threaten her, it simply looked at her. Whatever it communicated in that moment was not a threat in any language we have words for. It was something prior to threat, something older." He paused, then added, "The human did not look at the Admiral when the dragon did this. He already knew how it would end. He was looking at the door." Rail walked back through the hub to the freight bay. He had 2 tons of industrial bearings for a colony run on the far side of the corridor, and he needed to get them loaded before the departure window closed. Cinder rode on his shoulder. She had gone back to her ordinary self, dim glow, easy posture, tail occasionally looping around to rest against his collar. If she was aware of what she had just done in that room, she did not show it. She watched the crowds move around them the way she always watched the world, not nervous, not aggressive, just present, taking it in. At the freight bay, a dockworker Rail knew by sight gave him a nod and started running the loading arm. The dockworker glanced at Cinder. "That the one people are talking about." Rail said, "I don't know what people are talking about." The dockworker looked at him, then at Cinder, then back at him. He seemed to decide that was a reasonable answer. He went back to running the loading arm. Rail checked the cargo against the manifest. He did this carefully and correctly, the same way he always did it, because cargo that was loaded wrong caused problems on the other end, and problems on the other end cost time. Cinder stayed on his shoulder the whole time, and he talked to her while he worked, not full sentences, just commenting, the same way he had been doing since the second day on the ship. The freight bay was loud. The manifest was correct. The loading finished on time. He departed Durance Hub exactly on schedule. In the meeting room, Admiral Vurath was composing a report. She was finding, with mild frustration, that it was difficult to describe what had happened in language that would make sense to a superior officer who had not been in the room. She eventually wrote, "Cooperation was declined. Recommend monitoring at a distance. Do not recommend further direct approach at this time." Her aide asked her what reason she wanted to give for the last line. She thought about it for a moment, then she wrote, "Operational judgment." That was all. The colony on Selthar's Rest had been built into the side of a hill, the way most new colonies were built, pressed into the geography so that the land was doing half the work of keeping the weather out. From above, in daylight, it looked like a collection of pale geometric shapes tucked against the brown-green slope. From the landing approach, it looked small and a little tired, and entirely real in the way that working settlements were real, without decoration or pretension. Rail had a hold full of medical freight for them. Surgical supplies, diagnostic equipment, 3 units of field-portable imaging hardware. The kind of cargo that was not valuable enough to steal and not glamorous enough to mention, but which the colony had been waiting on for 6 weeks, and which the administrator had sent 3 increasingly direct messages about. He was on final approach when the situation became complicated. The first sign was a Concorde emergency frequency cut across his communications array. Not directed at him, it was broadband, the kind that went to everyone in range. A separatist faction called the Outer Fringe Consolidated had moved ships into the system overnight. They had a blockade up. They were in negotiation with Concorde over supply line access, and they were using Selthar's Rest as leverage. Rail noted this. He noted that he was already inside the blockade perimeter because he had dropped out of transit 2 hours ago for a routine engine check, and the blockade had gone up while he was drifting. He noted that his cargo was medical supplies for a colony that now had warships sitting over it. He kept on his approach. The medical supplies needed to get there. He landed without incident. The blockade ships were not stopping local traffic yet. The landing pad was at the base of the hill, and the colony's main road ran up from it, and Rail was starting to talk to the freight bay about unloading when the situation became complicated again. The ground unit arrived. 40 soldiers, Galthrek, moving down the main road from the eastern ridge. They came in organized and fast, the way soldiers moved when they had done this before and expected it to go smoothly. They were not the same unit from the Bren corridor. Different unit, different commander, no shared history with Rail at all. They were here to put people somewhere contained, while their general made his point to the Concorde, and they were going about it professionally. General Breck-Own came with the second wave 10 minutes later. He was a large Galthrek, older than his soldiers, with the particular quality of someone who had won enough engagements that he no longer found them interesting. He set up his command post at the bottom of the hill, near the landing pad. Rail was there. This was his bad luck, and the general's bad luck simultaneously, though only one of them would understand that within the hour. The general's soldiers collected everyone at the landing pad and moved them to a consolidated holding area in the colony's freight storage building. Rail went without argument. He was carrying a medical freight manifest, not a weapon. He was practical. He went where they pointed. Cinder was in the front chest pocket of his jacket. The administrator, Preth, was already in the holding area when Rail arrived, a middle-aged human woman with short grey-brown hair and the look of someone holding themselves very still so they would not shake. She nodded at Rail. He nodded back. 2 guards posted at the door, another inside walking slow laps, standard. The inside guard was a younger Galthrek, heavier than the ones at the door, and he was bored in a way that was making him careless. He walked his laps and stopped to look at things. He looked at crates. He looked at equipment. He looked at Rail. He noticed the pocket. Rail saw him notice it. He saw the guard's eyes track the slight movement under the jacket fabric where Cinder was breathing. Rail put his hand over the pocket. The guard walked over. He said something in Galthrek that the translator on Rail's wrist rendered as roughly, "What is in there?" Rail said, "Nothing important." The guard reached for the pocket. He got his fingers on the edge of the fabric. Cinder came awake in the same way she had in the Bren corridor, not gradually, but all at once, fully alert in a single instant. She felt the foreign hand. She felt the grip on the fabric. She understood everything she needed to understand in the first second. She came out of the pocket. The guard made a sound and pulled his hand back. Too late. She was already on his arm and climbing. Not to his arm because it was a threat to his face, because his face was what had been close to Rael's pocket, and Cinder was operating from a logic that was older than language and simpler than thought. This was the source of the wrongness, and it needed to stop. The two guards at the door turned. Cinder was white, not warming toward white, immediate and total, from the moment she came fully awake. The fire sacks were open, and the light she was putting out was hard to look at directly, casting the whole room in sharp shadow. She was the size of a hand, and she was, in that moment, the most important thing in the room, and every person in the room knew it without being told. What happened next was not a long fight. It was not, by any military definition, a fight at all. A fight involves two sides with comparable options. This was not that. The door guard who raised his weapon pointed it at Cinder on reflex. She turned her head. He lowered it. This happened faster than a decision. It happened in the place before decisions, in the part of a nervous system that is older than thought, and what it told him was simply and completely, no. Administrator Preth later said, when asked to describe the next 4 minutes, that she could not describe them accurately. She said she had pressed herself against the wall and kept her eyes mostly down. She said the light was very bright. She said she did not hear weapons fire. She said the room was quiet in a way that felt wrong, and then the room was quiet in a way that felt right. And when she looked up, Rael was standing in the middle of the room, and Cinder was on his shoulder, and there were no longer any guards in the room that were a problem. Rael opened the holding room door. He walked out. The colony ground was quiet in the afternoon light. Cinder sat on his shoulder, and the white was dropping out of her slowly, the way a coal goes from bright to dim, but holds the heat long after the light fades. She was still warm, very warm. He walked to the command post. He knocked on the door of the temporary structure the general had set up. It was a metal door. He knocked on it the way you knock on a door when you want someone to answer it, not the way someone who just walked out of a contained holding room should, probably, be knocking on anything. General Breck Owen opened it. He was a senior officer of significant experience. He looked at Rael. He looked at Cinder, who was on Rael's shoulder, still warm, slowly cooling. He looked at what Rael's expression was doing, which was the same thing it always did, nothing in particular. The general said nothing. Rael said politely, "I have medical supplies on my ship for this colony. I'd like to finish unloading them. If you're done here, the blockade lift would help with that." The general looked at Cinder for a long time. Cinder looked back at him. Her fire sacks were dim now, barely glowing, resting. Breck Owen turned to his communications officer. He issued an order. The blockade over Selthar's Rest lifted within the hour. The Concord observer, who had been watching events from the colony's communications building, walked out when the warships moved off. He found Administrator Preth standing at the edge of the landing pad, watching Rael's ship being unloaded by a couple of colony workers. Preth said, "What is that thing on his shoulder?" The observer thought about it. He had been reviewing every report, everything the archive had flagged over the past 6 months. He had a lot of context. He still was not sure he had an answer. He said, "As far as we can tell, the most dangerous creature in the sector. Nobody knows why it chose him." Preth watched the unloading for another moment. Then she said, "She seems happy." The observer followed her gaze. Cinder had moved from Rael's shoulder to the top of one of the medical crates, where she was sitting in the late afternoon light with her wings slightly open, warming herself in the sun, watching the workers with her usual calm attention. Rael was checking the manifest against the crates. He was not watching the warships leave. He was not looking at the command post. He was reading a manifest with one finger tracing the lines, the same way he had been reading manifests his entire working life, and occasionally he said something to Cinder about a crate number, and she ignored him in the comfortable way that meant she had heard. Yes, the observer said, she does. There is a kind of tiredness that is not about sleep. It is the tiredness that comes from being looked at too much, from being the subject of other people's attention when all you want is to do your job and go home. Rael had been tired in this particular way for about 3 months, since the Selthar's Rest incident made its way through the reporting channels, and his name stopped being a cargo hauler's name and started being the name people said when they told a certain kind of story. He did not like the story. The story made him sound like something he was not. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was a person who had bought a small animal from a market and then continued to live his life, and things had happened around that, and none of them were things he had planned or wanted. The only part of the whole year that felt like a decision he had actually made was the first one, stopping at that stall, turning around, paying the price that Hoss had named. Everything after that had simply been Cinder being Cinder. He told her this. He told her a lot of things. The talking to her habit had been going for nearly a year now and had long since stopped embarrassing him. He was in transit, 4 days out from Durance Hub, when Dr. Serath Ulo sent him a message. He had kept her contact information. He had not expected to use it, but he had kept it. The message said she was at Durance Hub, that she had been following the incident reports, and that she had something she wanted to say to him in person. She said it was not urgent, but it was important, and she would wait. He altered his approach to stop at the hub. Dr. Ulo was older than he remembered. A year was not much to him, but for the Voreni, who aged slowly, she looked more tired than time should have made her. She was waiting at a small table in one of the hub's quieter sections, away from the market, with 2 cups of something warm. She pushed one toward him when he sat down. Cinder climbed down from his shoulder to the table, inspected the cup, and retreated to sit near Rael's elbow. Ulo watched this with the expression she always had when watching Cinder, a kind of soft, precise attention, the same way she would look at a measurement she was trying to get right. She said, I have been reviewing everything, the Bren corridor, the customs incident, the meeting with Admiral Vurath, Selthar's Rest, she paused, and before those the small things, the dock worker, the Paro customs officer who cannot explain why he let you go. I have been building a picture. Of what? Rael asked. Of the bond, she said, and I think I was wrong about some of it when we first spoke. He waited. When we first spoke, I told you the bond was a survival link. That is true. I told you the fire sacks were dormant and scaled to threat level. That is also true. But I told you these things as though they were mechanical facts, like the bond was a system, a biological arrangement with inputs and outputs. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I have come to believe that is not quite right. Rael looked at Cinder. Cinder was watching Ulo with calm interest. Draconid miners have been in contact with dozens of species for centuries, Dr. Ulo said. Galthrek, Senari, Lethani, Vorani, every major species in the Concord has kept them as companions at some point. No full bond was ever recorded. Not one, in centuries. She looked at him directly. Then a human buys one from a discard shelf in a market, and within 1 year, the academic and military communities of 4 species are writing reports about it. Does that not strike you as strange? Rael said, I've been trying not to think about it. I know, she said, but I need you to think about it now, because I believe the explanation is important. She chose her next words carefully. The Draconid does not bond to strength. It does not bond to status. It does not respond to wealth or power or military rank. If it did, Vurath would have had a bonded dragon before she made Admiral, and she would have kept it. The Draconid responds to something we do not have a clean word for in any language I know. She paused. The closest I have is realness, the quality of being entirely and consistently yourself, with no layer between what you are and what you show. Rael did not say anything. Humans are very new to the galaxy, she continued. 40 years in the Concord. In that time you have been assessed, measured, classified, low military capacity, limited political reach, no particular biological advantages worth noting, a minor species. She looked at him steadily. What no one thought to assess was this quality. Because in a galaxy of ancient civilizations, species that have had 10,000 years to build hierarchies and status systems and social armor, this quality gets trained out. It gets optimized away. Children learn early that who they are is not what they show. The Galthrek armored it away in centuries of warrior culture. The Senari calculated it into something they manage rather than inhabit. The Lethani buried it so deep under politics that I'm not sure most of them can find it anymore. She picked up her cup. You are new enough that you have not learned yet. Rail sat with this for a long moment. He was looking at the table. Cinder had moved from near his elbow to the inside of his arm, resting against his forearm the way she did when she wanted contact without being on his shoulder. He said, "She picked me because I'm boring." Ulo's expression was the gentlest thing he had ever seen on a Voreni face. She picked you because you are real, in our galaxy, at our scale, after all the centuries of civilizations learning to be something other than themselves that is genuinely rare. She set down her cup. Not human, not species-specific, just rare. You were perhaps simply the first real person she ever encountered. Rail thought about the stall, the packed market, every species walking past that enclosure, and Cinder standing at the front with her uneven wings and her dim glow, watching all of them and choosing none of them, until one unremarkable human in a jacket walked by on his way to pick up a parts manifest. He said she was there for 2 months. Yes. She waited 2 months. Yes. He looked at Cinder. She looked up at him. The fire sacks were their ordinary dim orange, the color he had come to think of as her resting color, the color she was when she was calm and safe and close to him. She blinked slowly. The way she did when she was comfortable. Rail reached down and gently, with one finger, rubbed the side of her head. She leaned into it and the hum came low, felt more than heard, the sound that meant everything was right. He said to Dr. Ulo, "Thank you." She nodded. There was something in her face that was not quite sadness and not quite wonder, and was possibly both. He stood up. He zipped the front of his jacket up around Cinder so she would be warm. It was the same jacket he had brought her home in, worn soft now at the elbows. She settled into the warmth of it without being asked, just her head visible above the zipper, watching the world with those eyes. He said, "I've got to run to Selthar's Rest. They're rebuilding. They need equipment." Ulo looked at him. She said, "Of course you do." He left, the same way he had always left, everywhere, no ceremony, no looking back, just a person with somewhere to be. Ulo sat at the table after he was gone, and she opened her personal record, and she wrote for a long time. She wrote about the bond, and the year, and what she believed she understood now that she had not understood before. She wrote about the species assessment that the Concord had filed on humanity 40 years ago, and the measurements it had used, and the things it had not thought to measure. She wrote about a tiny creature waiting 2 months in a market stall for one specific person. At the end she wrote, "I am not certain the assessment of humanity as a minor species is complete. I am not certain we have been measuring the right things. A species that can still produce individuals like this, still real enough, still whole enough, for a creature of this sensitivity to recognize and choose, is not minor. It is simply legible in a way we have not bothered to read." She closed the record. In the docking bay, Rail's ship fired its approach thrusters and lifted off Durant's hub. Small ship, battered, old, the kind of ship nobody looked at twice. On the sensor display in the station traffic system, it was just a cargo hauler departing on a standard heading. Nothing special, nothing notable. The entry read, Aldgate Run, Human Registered, Cargo Class. In the cockpit, through the small forward window, there was a faint orange glow. It was barely visible, just a warmth against the dark. But it was there. It had always been there, from the moment she found him. It would be there for as long as he was. That was the whole of it, that was everything. A small creature, and the person she had waited for, going somewhere they were needed, and not making anything out of it at all.